The formation of any adventuring group requires some very key essential people. Steve was saying to Sherry as he made sure his harness had all his spell reagents in it. Right now, we've got sneaky, backstabbing, thievery-type stuff covered and, of course, offensive magic. Oh, so that's how you describe me? Sneaky, backstabbing, thievery-type stuff? Sherry growled as she crossed her arms, but Steve looked back at her, obviously surprised. What? I'm the backstabber who's good at thievery stuff? You've got loads of offensive magic spells. Plus, you're much better at dealing with people nicely than I am. You know how I, rub people the wrong way? He shrugged as she arched her left eyebrow slowly. I'm the magic caster? You're covering yourself in magic spell components have perhaps the most extensive spell tome ever made on your belt. She gestured, and he looked down at his harness for a moment. Yeah, so I can cast invisibility and then stab them with a spectral dagger. Or, a regular dagger. He still seemed confused. Speaking of, you seem to have more knives and daggers than any other mage I've ever met. Then again, you're not like any other mage I've ever met, are you? She mentioned. Well, because they're stupid. Knives are tools. You can use them for all manner of things. Any good adventurer has to have at least, 5 knives on them. He huffed as he mentally counted how many he had. Why don't we say between the two of us, we've got magic and subterfuge covered? She offered, and he shrugged. Fair enough. Anyway, we've also got healing covered now that my friend has agreed to join us. I guess things haven't been working out the way he's hoped back home. I figure it's gotta be hard being a follower of the love god in a dwarven capital. It's not easy to tell male and female dwarves apart with all their beards and whatnot, Steve mentioned. Then why do the dwarves have a love god? She asked. But before Steve could answer, the door opened and a dwarf in white heavy plate covered in hearts walked in, accompanied by strange, soothing music in the background. Ooh, no, baby, there's only one love god. She doesn't know race, she doesn't know creed, she only knows the purest emotion of all. Sweet, sweet, tender love. His voice rumbled out like melted chocolate being poured over strawberries, as Steve just waved at the dark-skinned dwarf. Sherry, this is... But he was cut off as the dwarf reached out to take Sherry's hand and pull it to his lips. Larry, love, white mage, at your service, honey child. He kissed his way as far up Sherry's arm as he could, considering their height difference. A white mage, not a cleric? She asked. Don't let the heavy plate and big hammer fool you. He's a white mage. I met this freak when he was 2 years into the 5-year white mage course. Can you believe those sex-crazed white mages actually have co-ed dorms? Madness. Takes all the fun out of sneaking in. Steve snorted. I owe everything to this man. He taught me how to dance. He taught me how to seeing. He taught me how to conjure up a warm fire to lay any wonderful woman down by and tenderly start to... She gets the idea, Larry, Steve interrupted. Anyway, what I was telling her before you showed up is that we've got magic, healing, and stabbing, but we need someone big and burly who can stand up front and take hits. Yes, and how are we going to find that person? Sherry asked. It's easy. We go to a tavern and hold tryouts. That's how it works. How hard can it be? Steve laughed. This is the 10th town, Steve. This isn't working, Sherry mentioned as Steve was hunched over the table they'd set up in the middle of the newest tavern. Things hadn't gone quite the way he was hoping. So far, he was discovering why it was that most kingdoms over here weren't all that worried about peasant revolts, when their stock of strong, capable fighters were already in the military, and those they left to run the farms. Well, and that's why you should let me join your adventuring group. I'll smack the crap out of monsters with Ma-Ho. The farmer brandished his farming implement, spinning it around a little before hitting himself in the leg with it, immediately followed by his face, after which his hoe went spinning off over Sherry's head, who ducked out of the way. To make things easy among the simple farming towns, she'd taken on the guise of a human, not Brunhilde. Steve was bummed. Next. Steve muttered and shook his head as the farmer wandered off, rubbing his face as he looked for his hoe. In the middle of the day in a farming community, the local tavern was only sparsely occupied. Most of the tryouts had already left after failing to impress, and Larry was off sweet-talking one of the tavern girls while her father, the tavern owner, glared at him from behind the counter. Steve would have to tip extra well. When he looked forward, there wasn't anyone else, so he just sighed. "We should have just taken that nice stable boy from a few towns back," she mentioned. "Who? The shit shoveler? Sure, the kid had heart, but he was kinda scrawny. Maybe in 15 years, if he keeps shoveling shit, he'll get stronger." He tapped his chin and looked around before gasping out, "I don't get it. All those bard tales talk about adventurers meeting up at taverns. But did they have tryouts? Or did fate intervene to make them all show up at the same time? You don't have it in good with fate." Sherry mentioned, and Steve nodded, acknowledging that fact. "I thought maybe I had it in good with luck, though," he muttered as he rubbed his chin. Then again, the thing about Lady Luck was she could be pretty fickle. Then he trailed off as he saw a little girl walk into the tavern. She looked a bit out of place, honestly. Peasants had simple clothes, but hers seemed to be made of furs and strips of leather. She also looked extremely pale, more like the nomads in the frozen wastes to the far north. "Hello there, little girl. Are you looking for your dad?" he asked, and glanced around the few drunks in the place, and noticed the tavern owner had now started cleaning a very large cleaver while watching Larry sweet-talk his daughter. Steve needed to do something about that soon. "Are you Steve Spellslinger?" the girl asked, then holding up one of the posters he'd put up around the area about their tryouts. Yes?" He caught Sherry's suspicious look at him, but he just shrugged, honestly confused. He highly doubted he was the father. The sailor's seal was one of the first spells he learned. He didn't have any intention of fathering anyone yet, or getting dire crotch crickets. "My friend wanted to talk to you, but—" The girl looked around, seeming nervous. "I don't know if this is a safe place." "Ooh, sweetie, this place is very safe. I promise I'll protect you and your friend. Where are they if they want to talk to me?" he asked. And then before his eyes, the girl vanished in a puff, before he was looking up at a 6.5-foot-tall werewolf. He gasped and was about to grab his spellbook to find some way to fight back when he stopped and focused on the creature. Were husky?" he asked then. "I'm actually, a werehuman, I think." "The were-human?" mentioned as she poked her fingers together nervously. The tavern owner at least was focused on her, and Larry had stopped feeling up the tavern girl. The were-husky, or possible werehuman, had reddish-brown fur mixed with white, and he noticed that one eye was green, while the other was blue. Unlike the girl, her clothes seemed to be made of some sort of shimmering scales bound with leather. But they looked like they'd been pried off a creature, and definitely weren't regular metal. She also had a sword and shield on her back that clearly hadn't been there. "A werewolf! I'll get the silverware! Dorothy, fetch the militia!" The tavern owner cried out, and the woman in Larry's arms quickly jumped up, but Steve got up as well. Whoa, settle down! This isn't a werewolf, it's the middle of the day, and it isn't even the full moon." He knew, of course, real werewolves didn't need to abide by the position of the moon alone, but he didn't feel a need to get into that right now. Besides, she's got clothes on. Werewolves transform as one creature and usually shred their clothes as they grow. She just sort of poofed and appeared. It's fine, everyone. He held up his hands, and the room slowly relaxed. "Thank you," the were-person said quietly. Steve noted that she even had the curled tail of a husky and scratched his chin slowly as he examined her. "So, who are you?" he finally asked. "Well, my owner always called me Toozy 'cause of my eyes which match hers. But the others called me Fenrina. I have traveled across half the world to find you." She started, and Steve dropped back into a defensive posture. "For revenge?" The husky blinked at that and shook her head. "Ah, no?" Steve relaxed then. "Oh, good. I didn't think anyone was out to kill me yet. Except crap. But you never know how things may get mixed up. See, it's just that you're the first person to travel a long way to find me, and most tales about traveling half the world involve revenge and the like." He explained his behavior to her. "Oh well, I do want revenge, but not against you. I was told you could help me. You helped my people when I was a pup. You defeated the indomitable." She frowned then as she struggled through the word. "Indomitable snowman?" Steve asked then before continuing when she nodded. It was really just an ice golem, but it did run on blood magic, bad stuff. Well, the way it was being used, it was bad stuff. Blood magic on its own is... Never mind. Steve realized he was veering off on a tangent and let her continue. Well, the creator came back, I guess. He killed my tribe, the husky explained as Steve groaned out. Shit. I thought I got the creator in the fight. I must have missed something. Blood mages are nasty little shits. Steve muttered as he rubbed his chin, thinking back on the fight a bit more than a year before. Well, when he attacked the town, I jumped in front of my owner before he hit her with a spell, and now we're sort of the same person. Kinda. The husky finished explaining as Steve nodded and had a sudden realization. Ah, the girl? Okay, so you're not exactly a were-human or a were-husky. You two are separate but the same. That's why you had different outfits. Okay, that's interesting. Evil blood magic usually gets defeated by pure love, and I can't think of any purer love than of a dog and their owner, and probably her love for you as well, Steve mentioned. But whoever cast it must have been very strong for it to still have some sort of effect. So you became a humanoid and your owner is sort of trapped. Fenrina nodded. Can you help me? She asked, and Steve rubbed his chin before shaking his head. Nope. I haven't got the faintest fucking clue of how to undo the magic. I'm willing to help, though. But, I'm trying to form a group of adventurers right now for some work. So, kind of busy, Steve mentioned. What do you need? I can fight, Fenrina insisted. Well, someone to stay up front and protect the rest of us, Steve explained. I can do that, she nodded. My armor is made from the scale of the colossal ice worm. I took one down myself, she said proudly before her shoulders dropped a bit. But it was a small one. That's still impressive. Steve tapped his chin as she looked at her sword and shield. Ancient runed weapons and armor from the nomadic snow tribes? He asked. Well, no. I just found these on an old skeleton as I wandered through a blizzard looking for help after that evil person killed my tribe. But Steve actually clapped at that. Oh, that's perfect. Old weapons found in a blizzard or other storm on an ancient and unmarked grave at the start of a revenge quest? Hold on to those. Those will turn out to be super ancient powerful relics or something. I swear. He was starting to get excited when Sherry spoke up. Are we seriously going to use her? She's a little girl. She gasped out. Hey, I'm almost 2, Fenrina protested. That's full grown for a husky, Steve said with a nod. I meant the girl. Sherry glared at them. Oh, well, we don't really know what's up with the magic curse that hit them. If I'm to cure them, I need to study them, which means keeping them close, Steve said. What's the girl's name? He asked Fenrina. Astrid. Does Astrid feel pain when you get hurt? He asked, and the husky shook her head. See, it'll be fine. Are you sure we can trust her? Sherry asked then. What if this is some sort of magical trick? A disguise of sorts hidden behind supposed blood magic? Steve was going to point out the half-demon should be the last person to accuse others of using a disguise spell, but instead he just looked back at Fenrina. I suppose that's a very good question, with only one good way to find out. He stepped around the table to look up a bit into he was going to stick with were-husky. He looked into her eyes then and took a breath, adopting a serious expression for a moment as she looked worried. Then he reached into a pouch and pulled out a treat. Who's a good girl? Who's a good girl? Who's a good girl? What's a girl? Fenrina's eyes went big and she began to pant a little as she dropped down, kneeling down as he dangled the treat up above her. Roll over! It was a bit awkward with her sword and shield on her back, but she rolled over for him. Play dead! He commanded next, and while on the ground she clutched at her chest. Ah! Blur! Bleg! And then stretched out, eyes closed, her tongue dangling from the side of her muzzle. Up! He commanded, and she quickly opened her eyes, sitting back up as he gave her the threat. As she chomped on it, he squatted down so he could squeeze and rub her face. You're such a good girl! You're the good girl! You're the good girl! Yes, you are! Yes, sir! Then he stood back up and nodded as he set his hands on his hips. Yep, I have more faith in her dedication to the team than I've ever had in anyone about anything. Also, how was that? I've never had the ability to ask a dog what they thought of those treats. So good, Fenrina gasped out as she comped up the last of it. Good, I'm glad. He nodded. So, all in favor of letting Fenrina tank for us? Tank for us? Sherry asked. It's an adventuring term, Steve replied. Anyway, all in favor? He raised his hand and looked at Larry. The goddess of love has a special place in her realm for creatures of boundless and immeasurable love, like dogs, and that's a fact. The dwarf seemed to agree. Steve then looked at Sherry, who sighed and then nodded. Fine, but we're going to be very good to her. No more making her beg for treats, Sherry demanded. No! I want more treats, Fenrina whimpered then, her eyes seeming to grow rather large. Treats are fine, but we're not making you act like you just did for them. It's not proper. Sherry glared at Steve, who just shrugged. Well, okay then. It's settled. We now have an adventuring group, but we have one more task before it's official, and I fear that it may be the most difficult task I've ever had to complete. He trailed off, his expression growing serious as he realized what came next. How many of these forms are there? Steve gasped out as he leaned over the counter, blinking hard a few times as he tried to read all the fine print. You're on the last one, the dwarf behind the counter said, already leafing through the massive pile of forms Steve had already completed. Mr. Spellslinger, my crayons are getting really short. He looked over at Astrid, then holding up one of the crayons he'd given her along with another picture she'd drawn on one of the many extra forms he'd given her. At least the forms were useful for drawing on. Hold on, sweetie, I'm almost done, he promised, and then saw the dwarf giving him a look. That's your tank? The dwarf was obviously skeptical as Stephen leaned in, whispering out, Magic curse! The dwarf then nodded in understanding. Okay, last form. He groaned then and picked the form up off the counter as he walked over to where the others were sitting. Sherry had dropped her disguise so as not to trigger the wards in the adventuring hall, and Larry was sketching something out with one of the crayons he had actually given Astrid. What's that? The goddess has blessed me with a vision in my dreams of a new instrument. It's like a harp, but with more strings and kept in a giant box. Sounds complicated. Steve rubbed his forehead as he looked at the sketch. Anyway, we need to come up with a good group name. Your benefactor wants us to run all sort of dangerous, possibly suicidal missions, right? Sort of making us an adventuring suicide squad? Larry mentioned. Ass! Steve said right away as Sherry glared at him. He was confused until she pointed down and he looked to see Astrid peering back up at him. Ah! Astrid! Astrid! Can Fenrina come out? The girl nodded then before there was a poof as the werehusky appeared. What I had meant to say is that the acronym for Adventuring Suicide Squad is ASS. The husky's ears flickered a bit then. Do you always swear so much? She asked, and Steve sighed. Astrid was like 9, and Fenrina just didn't like cursing since she thought that curse words actually cursed people. This was going to take some adjustments. Also, what's an acronym? It's when you take the first letter of a group of words and spell something out, like I just did. She blinked at him, and he frowned. Can you read or write? She shook her head. Can Astrid? Once more she shook her head. I'll have to teach you both, he muttered. But how about a nice name? She asked then. Like, the Friendly Adventurers Retrieval Team. Fart, Steve said with a sigh. Like, on command? Are you asking me to? Are you saying you just did? Fenrina looked confused. No, I mean, that's the acronym, he huffed. How about the Super Happy Intrepid Team? Sherry asked then with a smirk, and Steve glared at her. Okay, you, enough from you. He shook his head then. You know you seem to be one of the few people who loves acronyms so much. Maybe it's just an Almarin thing? Steve gasped as Larry suggested that. It is not! Everyone cares about acronyms, for adventuring groups especially. It's important. If you aren't careful, you end up with a terrible acronym. While he'd said that, Fenrina seemed to be thinking. Astrid and I both like misfits. Does that help? She asked, and Steve thought it over before shrugging. The misfits. There's nothing there. You need at least 3 letters for a proper acronym, or TLA if you prefer. The others looked at him. 3-letter acronym, he explained. Well, what other words do we want to help describe us? Fenrina asked. Dependable, Sherry said first. Look at us. We're hardly who people would think to call for help, so we want to make sure dependable is in the name. It'll help. I think we should be an order of something, because orders just sound cool, Larry requested next. So, the Dependable Order of Misfits, Fenrina suggested. Does that acronym mean anything? Steve stood there for a moment before he began to laugh, his voice growing deeper as the candles in the room flickered. Boah! It spells doom. Ah, where the hell did that thunder and lightning come from? Me papers are all over! The dwarf behind the counter was grabbing at the forms that had been tossed into the air, and they could hear a baby crying in the distance. We need help in the stables. Something spooked the horses, someone called out from elsewhere in the building. When the dwarf got the papers back in order, Steve was approaching with the last form, and the dwarf just glared up at him. You're gonna have to fill out some extra forms if you're an evil group. I swear we aren't evil, Steve protested. I just get enthusiastic. The dwarf kept glaring at him and held up a form with a pencil in hand. And just what shall I mark your group down for on the scale of good, evil, law, and chaos? Chaotic, Steve started. What? But we should follow the rules, Fenrina butted in. Laws are important, Sherry agreed. There are no laws in love. Romantic passion is often surprising and spontaneous. To weigh it down with rules and regulations is not cool. The dwarf's words were accompanied by some sort of distant, soothing trumpet instrument no one could exactly place. Steve sighed and rubbed eyes. Well, we're good, right? He looked back over at the group and didn't really hear any objections. But you call yourselves Doom? You have an evil laugh, not to mention the goatee of an evil sorcerer, the dwarf started. It's just a goatee. Facial hair doesn't make someone evil, Steve hissed back. And one of your rank is in fact a demon. Half, Sherry called out, but the dwarf just ticked off a box. I'll put you down for mixed, the dwarf replied. Now you just need to complete one quest on the board and it's official. She handed Steve a board with the list of quests that were open. Well, he thought the dwarf was a she. It was hard to tell what with the beards and the like, but he had a knack for telling. Oh, this one, Steve pointed, not needing to look very long. Are you sure? Most new groups don't normally want to take on an evil magic user at their first go. The dwarf was a bit surprised. Yeah, it's fine. I'm a mage. Ha! A human mage, sure. Steve glared at the dwarf then. But besides that, I actually know her. He went on after a bit. All right, we need to wait for night, but I know where to go. With that, he led the group out to go complete their very first quest as Doom. Man, tonight is plenty dark and stormy, isn't it? Fenrina peered up at the dark clouds above them, her tail down but not between her legs. We'll be fine. You've got more lightning protection than you'll ever need on, Steve promised. So, how do you know this person? Sherry asked. Oh, it's kind of a sad story, so if it's at all possible, try to take her down alive. See, she was several years above me in Arbitus, a quiet, bookish elf girl, very reserved. Well, one of the hottest guys at school invited her to a dance, but it was some sort of stupid joke and he didn't actually dance with her, so instead she ran off and became a... He paused then, as there was another crack of lightning before they heard the evil, yet feminine cackle coming from the graveyard before them. Fenrina gripped her sword and shield tight. Sherry readied her fell whip, and Larry stretched a little as he swung his mace around in big, lazy circles to get ready. Steve, however, just appreciated the magic at work here, as the moon broke out from behind the clouds to perfectly illuminate the elven figure before them. The vast amount of purple and black silk that made up her outfit made Steve wonder who her tailor was more than anything. It couldn't have been cheap. More adventurers here to try and strike me down. Soon you shall join my dancers of the damned. Ah ha ha ha! Her laughter ended then as she began to chant and cast a spell as she danced around, bright multicolored lights shooting up from the surrounding graves. What the hell kind of magic is this? Sherry asked in confusion, and Steve had to stop dancing to the music being made by the spell to answer. That's what I was going to say earlier. She got spurned at the dance, so she ran off and became a necrodancer. Well, let's get her before she finishes the spell, Sherry urged them, but Fenrina didn't move. Wouldn't that be rude? She asked. Normally, I'd say we should definitely not let someone cast something, but yeah, I think it would be rude to not let her finish. This is a super complicated spell. She's making it look easy, but come on, give her a chance. Steve agreed as Sherry gasped at them. Are you too serious right now? This is a fight! You don't just let your enemy finish casting a spell because it would be rude not to, or because it's complicated. And are you just ogling her because she's attractive? She pointed at Steve, who jumped a bit since he'd been watching the necrodancer and not Sherry. What? I mean, she's hot. He worried Sherry might attack him instead then. But it's to observe the way she casts the spell. It's complicated. I study magic. Besides, we want her alive, so if we let her cast the spell first, maybe it'll give us time to talk to her about it. This is insane! We need to attack her now before Sherry cried out, as they were now surrounded by the dancers of the damned and the zombified and skeletal remains started to attack them. Fenrina hack and slash! Sherry go for their legs! Larry bash skulls! Steve called out, as he began to quickly combine the ingredients for ice breath so he could freeze the oncoming wave of undead. They worked together very well, with Sherry knocking their legs out from under them as Fenrina smashed anything that got close, and Steve kept freezing the flanks so as they slowly rotated, they were able to keep dealing with the oncoming horde and not let any get too close. Considering how much fate hated Steve, perhaps it was just luck they worked together so well. Soon enough, they dispatched the dancing damned, and Steve nodded. Good work! Great whip work, Sherry! Good blocking, Fenrina! Larry, you... He looked around then. Where's Larry? He realized he hadn't seen the dwarf since the fight started. Had he been grabbed? What are they doing over there? Fenrina asked, and then pointed to two figures on top of one of the mausoleums in the cemetery. Steve frowned and squinted to see what she was pointing at in the distance. He could just make out two figures in the moonlight. Then he gasped before reaching up to try and cover Fenrina's eyes, even if she were a few inches taller than him. Oh no, look away, sweet summer child. But she started. Look away, he ordered as he began to guide her away from the cemetery. Sherry, just come find us when they're done. I am not staying here to watch, she protested. Fine. We'll all retreat to a safe distance and just wait it out, Steve muttered as he guided Fenrina along while she kept her eyes closed. Were they wrestling? I don't get it. Steve just shook his head as he realized what he'd signed up for with taking care of the part 9-year-old, part 2-year-old were husky. Then he realized that this hopefully didn't void their quest completion. She's good now? The dwarf asked. Yeep, had a change of heart after an intimate conversation with our white mage. Steve was rubbing his eyes as he tried to explain without explaining to the dwarf what had happened. I think that still completes the work order? It does. The locals say no one's been attacked, and it's verified that the cemetery is quiet and cleansed. Unusually so, in fact. They say it was like some mage came by to clean up the place. The dwarf looked at Steve, who just nodded. Yeah. We felt it would look good to, remove the guts and other fluids from the place. Really just clean it all up. He stared at the dwarf silently for another few seconds before the dwarf finally nodded. Well, they appreciated that. Good thing you had a dwarf mage with you. Hey, I did the spell casting. I'm a mage, damn it, Steve insisted. A human mage, that's right. You get the word out there's an adventurer group with a human mage. And we're way cheaper than those arrogant elven mages. You'll see. Okay. Well, it's all official. Your seal came through like you asked. You know you're here now. I can just adjust the forms to make you an evil group. If you change your mind later and become evil at a later date, it's a whole different process, even more forms. But Steve snatched the box from the dwarf's hand. We aren't evil. We are the dependable order of misfits, he shouted out, but nothing happened. After a moment, he took a deep sigh. It only happens when I use the acronym, doesn't it? He looked around the room and finally muttered doom. The horses are spooked again! The thunder scared my baby! Who put out the candles? Steve just looked sideways at the dwarf who had set paperweights on all her forms. "Whatever! We aren't evil! We're going to do great things! Great things!" he promised. And while that would be true, it was likely a good thing no one ever found out about their first real mission in dealing with the Hellurian Grand Library. But that's a story for another day.